This year we celebrate our 30th anniversary in June in Singapore with ChemCon Asia 2026. A great milestone. For the US Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, this year already marks its 50th anniversary. In 2016, TSCA's 40th anniversary, a TSCA reform was set into motion with the Lautenberg Act. For a short TSCA history lesson with a focus on the current implementation, I'm happy that Mark Herwig from the RTX Corporation is joining us. Mark, can you share with us some TSCA implementation highlights?
Hey, congratulations, Cheered, you and the team for 30 years doing ChemCon. It's an invaluable experience for professionals that work in this space. So again, congratulations. I'm happy to talk about TSCA a little bit, and I'll provide a little bit of a brief and hope to provide more in Singapore. I think the first thing to recognize is TSCA, Toxic Substances Control Act, which, by the way, is not legislation and regulations just on toxic substances. It's unfortunate that it was named as such back in the 1970s, but it is a chemical substance regulation, not just those that are toxic. But it has been around a long time, as I said, since the 1970s. And as time has gone on, it was considered old and outdated. And then fast forward into 2016 comes the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, LCSA, which gave the US EPA some expanded authorities to regulate chemicals. A few examples would be on the new chemical side, for which the agency has received PMNs or pre-manufacturer notifications, that the EPA essentially has to make an affirmative determination of an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment, whether it's under known, intended, or reasonably foreseen conditions of use of the substance in the US market. On the existing chemical side, for the first time, which sort of started with the so-called work plan chemicals, but then has morphed into a prioritization scheme where high priority chemicals are designated, as well as low priority chemicals. But on the high priority chemicals, the process is for it to go through a scoping, evaluation, and eventual risk management through rulemaking. So there's public comment and so on. An example of this would be methylene chloride. But there are quite a few in the pipeline. Some of them have had some delays, which I can cover in Singapore. But the essence is it's a slow and steady grind of substances going through, high priority substances going through this scoping, evaluation, and ultimate risk management rulemaking process. So since the LCSA, Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, which has now been in place for 10 years, there have been some learnings. And while some improvements have been made, there still are some folks, particularly in government, that aren't quite satisfied with how that has gone. And there are some in US Congress that are advancing some further measures to reform TSCA yet again. And some examples of reform would be reauthorization of the fee process or the fee structure, trying to find ways to be more efficient and effective in the review process for new chemical substances coming onto the market. And as I mentioned in my previous comments, that a couple of the existing chemical substances that have been through some of the pipeline, they were priority substances, they've been through the pipeline on prioritization, scoping, evaluation, and risk management. A couple of them have sort of been put into a pause mode for the agency in particular to do reconsideration of some of the conditions and some of the criteria that it had previously used in a different administration to come up with the final risk management scheme or schema for these substances. So in particular, it gets to more of the health and safety requirements and use of PPE for protecting employees, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of churn going on there. A few of the substances like trichloroethylene, for example, have been kicked down the road a little bit, but eventually it'll come around. We'll have final rules for those substances. And lastly, I would highlight that that the PFAS reporting rule under TSCA, otherwise known as the TSCA 8A7 reporting rule for PFAS, has been through a bit of a torturous process, from its original publication to where it stands now. There are further activities going on to modify the rule, and perhaps by the time Singapore comes around, we will have much more clarity on what EPA intends to do in terms of the rewrite or modification of the PFAS reporting rule, and what's in scope and what now through the modification is out of scope, and also the timing of reporting. That window of reporting has been also kicked down the road a little bit for a variety of reasons, including the CDX system for reporting not quite ready to handle reporting, but there's a consideration, not final yet, as of me talking to you here, but there's a consideration that the reporting window for the PFAS TSCA reporting rule will also be kicked down the road a little bit, but we'll see. And as it comes in June for the Singapore event, perhaps, as I said, there'll be some clarity, and I'm happy to share what I know with the delegates at Singapore.
Thank you, Mark. More on TSCA and PFAS on the federal level at ChemCon Asia 2026 in Singapore in June. So let's see if this final rule is ready by then. We have also seen many chemical regulatory activities at the US state level, some potentially conflicting with US federal activity. Can you briefly explain to us what is happening there?
Yes. In addition to the items that I talked about for the U.S. federal program under TSCA, there's certainly a lot going on in many of the states of the United States, mostly focused on what we call extended producer responsibility schemes, or EPR, but also on PFAS. Mainly focused on consumer products, but not solely on consumer-facing products. And I would say that, at least as of the day of this recording, that I wouldn't characterize these as being in conflict with what the EPA is doing, but rather additive. Note that I did not say supportive, but rather additive. So there are some views out there, whether substantiated or not, that one of the reasons why the states are moving in the direction that they're moving is because of the lack or extremely slow movement of the US EPA. Now, whether that's real or justified or not is sort of irrelevant in the end, because the fact of the matter is some of the states are doing work, particularly on EPR and PFAS. And so for global companies that are trying to do business from within the United States or outside the United States to be in the United States with products in particular, it can be quite a challenge to navigate all of this. So let's talk about PFAS. So in the case of PFAS, there are a couple of states, mainly or namely Minnesota and New Mexico currently, that have scoped their PFAS program far beyond consumer-facing products like toys and cosmetics and things like that. Not to diminish them, but the scoping of some of these state programs is quite large. And what the structure is of these programs, particularly Minnesota and New Mexico, is by issuance of rule. There are certain categories that are sort of exempted or excluded from certain aspects of the rule, but largely the rules require reporting. In the case of Minnesota, that's on or before July 1st, so very soon. And in the case of New Mexico, would be January 1st of 2027. And the idea of that reporting is that if you miss the reporting, you're a legal entity anywhere on the planet that has business interest in either of those states, and that business interest translates to manufactured products, which could be hard things, widgets, durable goods, complex objects, those sorts of things, as well as, bottles of this chemical and this formulated product, all of the above, that if you have such products that have intentionally added PFAS as it's defined by that state, then you are, generally speaking, obligated to do the reporting. There are some nuances, which I won't get into here, but the concept is that if you don't do the reporting, then essentially the day after the reporting is due, you're sort of barred legally from continuing to conduct business in that state. There are continuing obligations if you did do the reporting. Of course, all of this requires fees and money, but there are other obligations everywhere, or everything from labeling from New Mexico's program to developing and submitting currently unavoidable use, or CUU, applications to the state for further review. And those are all time-limited actions that have to be fulfilled. And the idea for those, generally speaking, is to allow more time and more runway, if you will, for entities that have products that contain PFAS to work their way out of it. The practical reality is that for many products, it's just not going to be possible as a technical matter in the way the product is designed and how it functions in its service life. So it's going to be a tough slog going forward here for some of the states. Now, I hope Minnesota and New Mexico remain to be the only two that are focused on this type of activity, but time will tell. So that's kind of where we're at with the states, and I'll bring some more to the discussion in Singapore.
So there's a lot going on in the United States of America. Can you also share some perspectives on the chemicals management plan in Canada, also in North America, but a different country with its own chemical regulatory scheme?
Yeah, sure, Jared. So getting outside of the United States, looking to our friends to the north, literally our friends, despite what you might see on television. The Canadians have a similar program, but it's not an exact program to the United States program under TSCA. There are similarities, but it's not a mirror image of it. And so I will defer to my colleague Dan Bastien, who I'm hopeful will be able to shed a much more insight on the Canadian program, particularly on the new chemical side. But I'll share with you briefly here on the existing chemical side. A recent activity in Canada is the release of a 2025 version of what's called PCTSR, which stands for Prohibition of Certain Toxic Substances Regulation. It had been around since 2012, and the 2025 update essentially has added substances to its scheme or schema for prohibitions. And in this case, there were I think it's 18 chemical substances or chemical families in combination that were there in 2012, and with this update in 2025, no surprise, added 3 different PFAS categories, specifically PFOS, PFOA, and long-chain perfluorocarboxylic acids, or LCPFCAs. HBCD and PBDE were also added, so a total of 5 more families. Of course, PFAS is not just PFAS. There are structural isomers and salts and things, so that they are sort of categories of PFAS that are now part of this prohibition. So, a lot of activity in North America. I mean, there's clearly a lot of activity in Europe and other parts of the world, but North America is not shy about its activities. And hopefully we'll be able to share more in Singapore.
Thanks, Mark. A lot more on the USA and Canada at ChemCon the Americas 2027. But first, ChemCon Asia 2026 in June in Singapore. Looking forward to seeing you there.